Hey, what's up? It's Marcel here, and in this walkthrough, I'm going to teach you how to use our estimate and time tracking setup guide to get your estimates and your time tracking tools set up correctly so that they map to each other, so you're able to run reports quickly, answer your questions quickly, and ultimately start running the agency profitability flywheel in your business. So the purpose of this exercise is to make sure that you are creating the right data structures for your business so that you can answer the questions that you want to be able to answer, so that you can set up your tooling so that they answer those questions quickly, and so that you can reduce the amount of complexity that is required when it comes to running reports and answering those questions, and make it easy for your team to be compliant with these things. A couple of really important things to remember is, number one, we're going to want to reverse engineer our thought process so that we focus on answering the right questions, the questions that we need answers to in order to run our business the way that we want to. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like as we go through the framework. The second is avoiding too much complexity. One of the things that's easy to do when we get into this time tracking thing and we get into estimation is we start to try and get way too granular about the questions that we want to be able to answer, and then that ends up making it nearly impossible for the tools that we want to use to actually be set up to answer all those questions. It makes it incredibly difficult for our team to track time at the right level of detail to help us answer those questions. So we're going to want to really make sure that we check ourselves on complexity. And then the last one is we don't correctly map these things. So we set up our estimate to have all these different fields, and then we don't do the right work to go into our time tracking tool and reconcile what piece within the time tracking tool is going to map back to that line item on the estimate. So we're going to walk through all of those things, and let's get started with the first kind of important thing to note, which is where does this process fall in the agency profitability flywheel? And the answer is it's the first part. It's the standardization of estimates and time and cost tracking, and really it's creating a feedback loop between those two things. So let's dive in. What we're trying to do here is essentially create a relationship line for us to estimate going forward with. So we're taking the relationship between our scoping metrics, which is really the questions or inputs that we're asking our clients when we are, doing a discovery call with them. So this might be things like, hey, what's your budget? How many web pages on that website? How many pieces of content do you need? Things that we ask them to try and figure out, like, how hard is this project going to be? How much time, how many resources is it going to take? And ultimately, what should we charge? And what do we think it's going to take us to get this completed? So we want to start tracking those inputs and those outputs. And that's really what we're doing here by standardizing our estimation and our time tracking. And that's going to allow us to build a relationship line over time so that we can actually use a formula to estimate our work and have that be accurate. So it's both fast and it's accurate. And by the way, if you're looking for a tool that helps you implement this exact process and create these kind of graphs for you based on your past work, definitely give Parakeeto a try. But with that, we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the first step in this process is to reverse engineer your thought process. And the question that you want to ask yourself here is, if a project turns into a dumpster fire, if something goes really, really badly, what are the questions I'm asking myself to try and get to the bottom of why it happened? And I want you to stop and think about this and kind of just write down, what's the first question I'm asking? What's the second question I'm asking? And you're going to write that down on the left-hand side. Then the second part here in the right-hand side is you're going to write down what are the metrics that you could use to answer that question. So it's going to start to give you a sense of what are the most important questions for us to answer, and then what kind of metrics do we need to be able to track in order to answer those questions. So an example of this filled out would be, did we over budget on this project? And then a couple of examples of ways you could answer that, maybe total project hours versus the budget, or what the project ABR was versus the budget, with the target. What services did we go over budget on? So maybe if I'm tracking time against a specific set of services, I can go and I can run a report to get the hours tracked against those services versus what the budget was. If I want to know who was working on that, maybe I can run a report for the team. And if I want to know what particular task that was done on, I could probably just do that through a conversation with the team. I don't necessarily need to track time at the task level, but again, we want to just think about this in terms of how would I go about investigating this today, and let's get a sense of what are the questions that I need to be able to answer. Once we've done that, then we want to kind of identify where we need to land on this kind of complexity graph. So on one axis here, we have insight by person. And generally, this is not what's adding the most complexity. Most time tracking tools are well set up to tell you who tracked the time, or, perhaps what kind of role they had or something like that. So the by person axis is not really going to be that impactful in terms of complexity, but what is going to be impactful is when you start looking into process insight. So depending on how you set up your contracts with your clients, maybe you have a contract. Within that contract you have different projects. Within different projects you have different deliverables. Within each deliverable maybe you've got design and development and like all these different services. Then within those maybe you have tasks, or you have other deliverables within that, and then within those deliverables you have tasks, and then within each task you have subtasks, right? So you can see how, depending on how you set up your projects and what the cascading effect of that contract is, the level of granularity, each level that you go deeper, requires a more complex time tracking tool to just even be able to support those things. And then it requires a more and more detail from your team when they're inputting time. And that starts to increase complexity very quickly. So what I encourage you to think about here is, how can we really simplify this to get us enough insight to know where to look, where to have a conversation with the team to get insights, without making it so complex that it's prohibitive, that we can't even set up the tool properly to do this, or that it takes our team way too much time and detail to fill out their timesheets, which is going to lead to a lot of mistakes. It's going to lead to low compliance. It's going to lead to people just putting time in random places, and it's going to mess up your data. It's not going to be helpful anyway. So think about how to reduce your complexity, and you'll probably end up, somewhere in this range here, somewhere in this range. Okay. So think about how to set up your tool. What's the level of complexity that you need? And then what we want to do is this. We want to align our estimate to our time tracking tool. We see this all the time. You've got line items in your estimate that don't map to anything in your time tracking tool, and that's when you start to run into problems, and it starts to become difficult to run reports and answer questions. So the next step here is to really map what is the metric on our estimate. So let's go through each kind of hierarchical line item on the estimate. So who's the client? Maybe what's the project? Within the project, maybe you've got deliverables. Within deliverables, maybe you've got services, right? So let's map that out, and then let's go over to the time tracking tool, and let's figure out what is that going to map to in the time tracking tool. So an example of what this might look like is, we have the client on the estimate. Great. We have a client section in the time tracking tool. We have a project on the estimate. Great. We have a project inside the time tracking tool. We have services in the estimate. Well, the time tracking tool doesn't have anything called services, but we can use the task module that they have to map back to our services. So maybe the tasks inside of, in this case might be harvest, are going to map to our services. So there'll be design, development, etc. Right? So let's use that. And then we have people on our estimate, and we're going to map that to the employees in the time tracking tool. That seems to work well. So again, go into your time tracking tool, open up your estimate, and really figure out like what is everything going to map to. So when you run a report, you know exactly what column is going to map back to the estimate. And when you set up a project, you can start to figure out what is the right configuration here to make sure that I can get these questions answered. And once you've gone through that exercise, you should be ready to go and deploy these two systems, deploy your estimation template, deploy your time tracking tool, and you should be set up for success here with regards to data structures. So with that, if you're looking for a tool that's going to help you deploy that correct structure in your estimates and create a really tight coupling, in this case, specifically with Harvest, definitely give Parakeeto a try. It is a great way to streamline this process, save time, and create that feedback loop between your estimates and your actuals that is going to be fundamental to this profitability flywheel. Give it a try. It's absolutely free. There's no risk. There's no credit card required. You will not be disappointed. And with that, I hope this training was helpful, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.